Now it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, whose time with us today has been generously sponsored by Amoresco. This year, our committee looked for a keynote speaker that our members would find truly inspirational. We looked high and low, and then like so many things in life, we found Father Greg Boyle when we least expected it. A colleague of mine was listening to National Public Radio in the US and heard Father Boyle speak. He was struck by Father Boyle's insight, compassion, and humility. He knew we had found our speaker and were proud to have him here today. Father Gregory Boyle is the founder and executive director of Homeboy Industries, the largest gang intervention, rehabilitation, and reentry program in the United States. A native of Los Angeles, Father Greg was ordained a Jesuit priest in 1984. He was transformed by his work with those who live at the margins in Bolivia, Mexico, and Folsom Prison. His dedication to finding a place for all in our society brought him to Boyle Heights community of East Los Angeles, where he served as pastor of Dolores Mission Church, then the poorest parish in the city, from 1986 to 1992. It was there that Father Greg started what would become Homeboy Industries, a nonprofit organization that employs and trains more than 300 former gang members every year in 7 social enterprises. Now located in downtown Los Angeles, Homeboy also provides a path to change and free critical services to 12,000 people who walk through their doors every year. Homeboy's unique and innovative approach of on-the-job training in conjunction with essential wraparound services, including mental health therapy, tattoo removal, and case management, has become a model for organizations around the world. Father Greg is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Tattoos on the Heart, The Power of Boundless Compassion. His debut book has been honored by the Southern California Indie Booksellers Association, Penn USA, Publishers Weekly, and Goodreads Choice Awards. He is currently working on his second book, Barking to the Choir, now entering the kinship of God. Please help me in welcoming to the stage Father Greg Boyle.
Thank you very much. I like the music. Gosh, you know, for 30 years I've worked with gang members, so, apparently the organizers of this event felt that made me eminently suited to address this crowd, so take that up with them. I give a lot of talks, and I've been to Toronto several times and all over Canada, and and then YouTube is sort of the bane of my existence, and TED Talks. So people hear you before, and I'm always kind of, although maybe this crowd hasn't so much, but it always happens, somebody's heard me before. And once I was at a foster grandparent gathering, a huge gathering in Southern California, and I had spoken at it the summer before, and for some reason they invited me 2 summers in a row, and after the second talk, this grandmother came up to me, and I think she liked the talk. She had big tears in her eyes, and she grabbed both my hands, and she said, "I heard you last year. It never gets better." So I suppose I'm delusional in thinking maybe she misspoke there, but anyway, thanks for your attention this morning, and what you do for a living is you try to kind of have folks, especially those who are underserved and low income, kind of feel that they've somehow fallen within your notice, and people want that, I had a very earnest gang member stand in front of my desk, and he said, "Look, I need your divided attention." And I said, "You are in luck today, because that's exactly what you'll be getting." So there's a vision that brings you to your work, and it's a vision about wanting the world, in fact, to look differently than it currently looks. But the prophet Habakkuk writes, "The vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, wait for it." But my sense of you already is that you don't want to wait for too long, con los brazos cruzados, tapping your feet and staring at your watch as you want to make something happen. And here's what I'm kind of an aerial view guy, so I'm going to suggest what I think what you do for a living and what you want to make happen is you want to create a community of kinship such that God, in fact, might recognize it. As Sylvia said earlier, housing opens doors, and I think it opens the door to this sense of kinship. Mother Teresa, I think, diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? How do we imagine a circle of compassion and then imagine nobody standing outside that circle? How do we seek together to dismantle the barriers that exclude? And so what you do in your own particularity really is to inch your way out to the margins and you stand there. And I think this is important because if you check under your feet, you'll discover that the margins are getting erased because you've chosen precisely to stand there. And you stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. And you stand with those whose dignity has been denied. And you stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. Every once in a while, you get this privileged moment to be able to stand, in fact, with the demonized, so that the demonizing will stop, with the easily despised and the readily left out, with the disposable, so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. I suspect that if kinship was in fact our goal, we would no longer be promoting justice. We would in fact be celebrating it. No kinship, no justice. No kinship, no peace. Housing opens doors. And this is what you do. You lead people to a sense of belonging and kinship and exquisite mutuality. So for 30 years, I've worked with gang members, and I'm so grateful to them because they've taught me everything of value. But in the last couple of years, they've taught me how to text, and I just am so grateful to them because I find that it sure beats the heck out of actually talking to people. And I'm pretty dexterous at it, you know, LOL and OMG and BTW, and the homies have taught me a new one, OHN, which apparently stands for, oh, hell no. And I've been using that one quite a bit lately. So I have 400 employees at Homeboy Industries, and there I am one day with two older vatos, you would call them gang members, Manuel and Poncho, and older guys been to prison, tattooed, and they do a variety of things for me. They're going to help me give a talk, so we meet at 9 and we drive to this high school some distance from Los Angeles. And Manuel's in the front seat, and he gets an incoming text, and he reads it to himself, and he chuckles. And I said, what is it? Oh, it's dumb. It's from Snoopy back at the office. Well, I just seen Snoopy. Snoopy gave me a big abrazote before the day began. And Snoopy and Manuel work together in the clock-in room where they clock in hundreds and hundreds of our workers, and it's a tough job, actually. And I said, well, what's he say? Oh, it's dumb. Hang on a second. Hey, dog, it's me, Snoops. Yeah, they got my ass locked up at county jail. They're charging me with being the ugliest vato in America. You have to come down right now and show them they got the wrong guy. Well, we died laughing, the three of us, and then I realized that Manuel and Snoopy are enemies. They are from rival gangs. They used to shoot bullets at each other. Now they shoot text messages. And there's a word for that, and the word is kinship. How do we obliterate once and for all the illusion that we are separate, that there is an us and a them? There's an idea that's taken root in the world, and it's at the root of all that's wrong with it, and the idea would be this, that there just might be lives out there that matter less than other lives. How do we stand against that idea? How do we bridge any distance that might exist between us? The haves and the have-nots in particular. You know, even in service, there's a distance, and you want to bridge even that. service provider, service recipient. At Homeboy Industries, I'm not the great healer, and that gang member over there is in need of my exquisite healing. The truth is, we're all in need of healing. We're all a cry for help. It's one of the things that unites us as human beings. One of the great privileges of my life was knowing Cesar Chavez, the organizer of the farm workers, and he was a friend. And I can remember once a reporter had commented to him and said, "Wow, these farm workers, they sure love you." And Cesar just shrugged and smiled and said, "The feeling's mutual," which of course is the hope that somehow we will arrive at this great place of mutuality. For service is good, but service is the hallway that leads you to the ballroom, and you want to get to the ballroom. Housing opens doors, and that's the place you want to enter, is a place of kinship. No homie gang member ever found more job opportunities in my office than this guy, Caesar, also named Caesar. And I knew him since he was a little kid growing up in the housing projects in Pico Gardens, where my parish was. Got into a gang, got into trouble, but there was this period of time in his life, his early 20s, where I'd find him a job, and before too long, he'd always gravitate back to vague criminality, usually something involving drugs, the sale of or the use of. And then he'd be back again, like a yo-yo. And so this one time, he had finished a 4-month probation violation, and there he is sitting in front of my office, and he says in front of my desk, he says what gang members often say, "This time it'll be different." I go, all right. So with him sitting there, I call a friend of mine who runs a vending machine company. This guy had hired gang members in the past. I was hoping he'd do the same now. And he does. He says, "Tell Caesar he starts tomorrow." And so Caesar begins work at this vending machine company. Well, 2 weeks later, there he is again, sitting in front of my desk. I go, "Híjole, Madre Santa, here we go." But this time, he pulls out of his pocket his very first paycheck. And he says, "Damn, gee, this paycheck makes me feel proper. I mean, my mom, she's proud of me, and my kids, they're not ashamed of me. And you know who I have to thank for this job." And I said, "Well, gosh, who?" And he looked at me strangely, and he said, "Well, God, of course." "Oh, yeah, no. No, that's right. That would be God, yeah." He said, "You thought I was going to say you." I said, "No, gosh, God's number one." He said, "You are so lucky we're not living in them Genesis days." Them Genesis days. He said, "Yeah, because God would have had struck down your ass already by now." Well, all I remember is we dissolved in laughter and fell out of our chairs, and I have no idea who's the service provider and who's the service recipient. It's mutual. So as was mentioned, Homeboy Industries was born a long time ago, around the same time ONPHA was, 1988, during the time I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, nestled in the middle of 2 public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village, and at the time they comprised the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs at war in those 2 housing projects, making it, according to the Los Angeles Police Department, the highest concentration of gang activity in the whole gang capital of the world. I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988, and I buried my 183rd 3 weeks ago. We did a lot of things in those early days. First, we started a school because there were so many junior high, middle school age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them. And so they were violent and wreaking havoc in the project. So I walked out to them and I said, "If I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And to my surprise, every single one said yes. And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so that kind of forced my hand a little bit. And so I went to the convent, which was located on the 3rd floor of our elementary parochial school, 2 floors the school, and the whole third floor was the convent. I gathered the nuns together and I said, "Hey, would you guys mind, moving out, and we could turn the convent into like a school for gang members, and they said, sure. And so we did, and gang members came to the church, which kind of upset the apple cart a little bit, because aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed, good people in and bad people out? So that was a good challenge. And then the gang members said if only we had jobs, and so myself and the women in the parish, we marched around the housing projects trying to find felony-friendly employers, and that wasn't so forthcoming. And so we did a lot of things. We had the homies build a child care center and paid them to do graffiti removal, all sorts of things, but the demand was so great. So I went to a movie producer and I said, buy this old abandoned bakery across the street from the church, and we'll call it Homeboy Bakery. And so he thought it was a good idea, and so enemy rival gang members baked bread together. And a month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market, which is a kind of historical place in Los Angeles. Once we had plural, we came up with the highfalutin Homeboy Industries, as if there was any industry involved in this venture. Not everything worked, and I will be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew, people didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And nobody intends to ever do this, but you back your way into becoming stuff sometimes, and so we've backed our way into becoming the largest gang intervention, rehab, and reentry program in the United States. 15,000 folks a year walk through our doors. Keep in mind there are 1,100 gang members and 120,000 gang members. 1,100 gangs and 120,000 gang members in LA County. And so we offer all sorts of things, 44 curricular offerings, from anger management to parenting, you name it, GED. We still have a school with 105 students. That's for all our trainees, 250 trainees who are there for 18 months. Case management, mental health therapy, free tattoo removal. No place on the planet Earth removes more tattoos than we do. We have a designated clinic, 3 laser machines, 1 paid physician assistant, but 37 volunteer doctors. So if any of you are starting to regret that ONPHA tattoo you have, Sylvia, see me afterwards. And it was born because of a guy named Frank who wandered out of Corcoran State Prison. 2 days out of prison, he's sitting in front of my desk, and I'd never met him before, and tattooed on his forehead like a billboard, filling the entire space, and pardon my French, but it said, "Fuck the world." And he said, I am having a hard time finding a job. And I said, well, Frank, maybe we could put our heads together on this one. So I hired him, and he bagged bread for 2 years, and I went to find a doctor, and I found one at a hospital who had a laser machine, and he gave me 1 hour a month to chip away on Frank's forehead and a few others. Pretty soon I had a waiting list of 3,000 gang members who wanted this service. And in parentheses, Frank is now a security guard at a movie studio in Hollywood, and there is no trace left of the dumbest thing he'd ever done, proving that all of us are a whole lot more than the worst things we've ever done. And so we have all our training programs. We have a solar panel installation training program. That's where they get nationally certified as in this. We have Homeboy Bakery still, Homeboy Silkscreen, our biggest business. We have Homeboy Diner, the only place you can get food at City Hall in Los Angeles. If you fly to LA, go to LAX, and if American Airlines may well be your carrier, that's where we have a restaurant as well since February. We have 26 farmers markets where we sell our stuff. We have 3 organic mini farms where we provide produce for our restaurants. We have Homeboy Homegrown merchandise where you can buy our logo stuff online or in the store. And Homegirl Cafe, where women with records, young ladies from rival gangs, waitresses with attitude will gladly take your order. A couple of years ago, Oscar-winning actress Diane Keaton shows up for lunch. She of Academy Award for Annie Hall and Godfather movies, big movie star. She shows up with a regular, a guy who's there once a week. And her waitress is Glenda. And Glenda's a big girl, tattooed, been to prison, gang member, felon, parolee. She does not know who Diane Keaton is, and so she's taking her order. And Diane Keaton says, well, what do you recommend? And Glenda rattles off the 3 platillos that she particularly likes. And Diane Keaton says, oh, I'll have that second one. That one sounds good. And at that point, something dawns on Glenda. She looks at Diane Keaton. She says, wait a minute. I feel like I know you. Like maybe we've met. And Diane Keaton decides to sort of deflect it humbly. Oh, gosh, I don't know. I suppose I have one of those faces that people think they've seen before. And then Glenda goes, no, now I know. We were locked up together. Yeah, that just took my breath away when I heard it. And I don't believe we've had any further Diane Keaton sightings now that I think of it. But suddenly kinship so quickly, Oscar-winning actress, attitudinal waitress, exactly what God had in mind. And if you'll permit me, I'm a priest. What is on God's mind? Well, I think can be expressed sometimes when Jesus speaks to the gathered and he says that you may be one. It's about kinship. Housing opens doors to that. All of us are called to be what Alice Miller, the late great child psychologist, called enlightened witnesses. People who, through your kindness and tenderness and focused, attentive love, return people to themselves. You do it in a particular way through housing and helping folks who need a hand. You don't hold the bar up and ask anybody to measure up. You just show up and you hold the mirror up and you tell people the truth, knowing that your truth is my truth, and my truth is a gang member's truth, and their truth is somebody who's seeking affordable housing's truth. And it's all the same truth, and here's the truth. You are exactly what God had in mind when God made you. But then you watch folks, especially on the margins, as they become that truth, as they inhabit that truth, and no bullet can pierce it, no 4 prison walls can keep it out, and death can't touch it because it's huge. But all of you, I think, have probably had this experience where you need to reach in sometimes with folks who are struggling in getting housing. You have to reach in and you have to dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. Lately, I've been taking a leisurely stroll through the Acts of the Apostles, and I suppose you could read it as a quaint snapshot of life in the earliest Christian community, or you could see it as the measure of health in any community at all, the communities that you contribute to creating. Things will leap off the page if you read it that way. See how they love one another. That's a great measurement. There's nobody needy in this community. That's an excellent metric. But my favorite one was this, just leapt off the page. And awe came upon everyone. It would seem that the measure of our health as a community may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So some years ago, I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, and to give an in-service all day long on gangs. So I brought 2 gang members with me who work for me, Andre, an African-American gang member, and Jose, a Latino gang member, and I invited them to get up at different times to tell parts of their story or the whole story. And I'd never heard their stories before. And Jose began at Homeboy as working on our janitorial crew, and he moved up to become a valued member of our substance abuse department, a man solidly in his own recovery. And, but, gang member, tattooed, been to prison, but also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. And he got up to tell his story, and I'd never heard it before, and began in sort of an offhanded way. He said, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when my mom looked at me and said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers gasp. And he says, it sounds way worser in Spanish, he says, Then he said, I guess I was 9 when my mom drove me to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage. And she says, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me. And my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day, my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school every day. First t-shirt, because the blood would seep through. Then the second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school would make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? Then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with the emotion of it, and he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story only he could see. And when he could speak through his tears, he said, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. And now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. The measure of your compassion lies not in your service of those on the margins, but in your willingness to see yourselves in kinship with them. All that ails us requires healthy, good treatment plans, but there's never been a treatment plan ever that's healthy and good that was born of a bad diagnosis. You want to get stuff right. You want to diagnose stuff right. Some years ago, I was diagnosed with leukemia, and I've gone through chemo and feeling okay at the moment, or as the homies still say to me, I hear your cancer's in intermission. I said, yes, apparently it's stepped out to the lobby to buy some popcorn. May the line be long. But this news was advertised on the front page of the LA Times, so the word spread, and homies came out of the woodwork and were very sweet. I got a call from a homie in jail, and he had just read this in the LA Times, and he says, hey, what's up with this leukemia anyway? And I said, well, it's cancer. It's in the blood. The doctor says my white count's too high. And he says, them doctors, they don't be knowing nothing. And I said, why? Well, hello, course your white count's high. But when I tried to give blood, and the guy taking my blood said, I can't tell you anything, but you got to go to your doctor right away. And so I did. And the doctor said I had mononucleosis, so he treated me for mono for a year. And I think we can agree that there's a difference between leukemia and mononucleosis. But a bad diagnosis is never neutral. It always, you waste time, it puts you behind the 8 ball. We always want to diagnose whatever is out there, from homelessness to drug addiction to gang involvement. You always want to get this one right. So there I am on the Dr. Phil show. Do you know who Dr. Phil is? Yeah, what was I thinking? I don't know why I was, but we thought we had talked the producers down from doing something cuckoo. And there I am backstage, and I can hear Dr. Phil say, and now, ladies and gentlemen, the founder and executive director of Homeboy Industries, Father Greg Boyle. And I go out there, and people are clapping, and it's a live audience. And to my horror, there's Phil sitting in his stool in the middle of the stage. My empty one is next to him, awaiting me. But on his side of the stage is a beautiful, gorgeous mahogany coffin on those 4-wheel gurney thing. And on my side of the stage is a perfectly reconstructed jail cell with bed and sink and toilet and bars. They went to great expense for these 2 set pieces. Well, you already know where this is going, and so his producers fly out these 3 young males, 14, 15, 16, an African-American, Latino, and a white kid, all kids who have gravitated perilously close to gang involvement. They flew them out with their very distraught single mothers. Each kid he brings out and separately, and he sort of grabs them figuratively by the lapel and says, don't you see where this choice is leading you? To death or to prison. Finally, by the 3rd kid, I have to intervene, and I say, Phil, how do I break this to you? These kids know this better than we do. They're not awaiting more data. They don't need more information. They know this will lead to death or to prison. They don't care that it will. This is about a lethal absence of hope. No kid is seeking anything when he joins a gang. He's always fleeing something, always. Gangs are the places kids go when they've encountered their life as a misery, and who doesn't know by now that misery loves company? And so we stand out at the margins wanting to get this diagnosis right, choosing not to demonize anybody, standing with the disposable, so the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And all of you stand out there and announce the open door, which affordable housing is, so that it'll lead to true kinship. And maybe people will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. What you do for a living is you make those voices heard. A last story, and I'll leave you. People always ask me about how difficult it is for enemies to work together, and it's hard at first. A gang member will come in and say, I'm ready. And I'll say, okay, I got an opening in the bakery, and you have to work with X, Y, and Z, and I rattle off the names of enemies, rivals. And they always do the same thing. They think and they say, okay, I'll work with them, but I'm not going to talk to them. Which used to bother me in the old days, until you discover, of course, that it's impossible for human beings to demonize people they know. You can't really sustain that. And so I had a kid named Youngster. That was his gang name. Everybody called him Youngster. I thought he was ready for the job, and I bring him over to our Homeboy silkscreen factory, our biggest business, been around for 20 years. Thousands of enemy gang members have worked their way through there. And I introduce him to his 30 coworkers, and I watch as Youngster shakes the hand of every single one, even enemies, looks them in the eye. And I think, wow, this is great. Until he gets to this last guy who seems to be wanting to avoid this encounter altogether, a kid named, everybody called Puppet. And when Puppet and Youngster are in each other's vicinity, they mumble something, they stare at their shoes, they don't shake hands. Well, I know they're enemies because I know what gangs they're from, but he just shook hands with other enemies. I discover later that this is a hatred that's really quite deep and quite personal, beyond which neither of them seem to be able to get past. So I sense that much at the moment, and I look at him and I say, look, if you guys can't hang working together, let me know. I got a bunch of people who want this job. And they don't say a word. Well, 6 months later, Puppet leaves his house, walks to a store some distance from his home, one of those corner stores. He buys something. But on the way back, he decides to take a shortcut, and for some reason, and he dodges into an alley. And suddenly, unexpectedly, he's surrounded by 10 members of a rival gang, 10 against 1, and they beat him badly. And he falls to the ground, and while he's lying there, they will not stop kicking his head until he's lifeless. Somebody finds his body and takes him to White Memorial Hospital, where he's declared effectively brain dead. But it's the policy there to keep you connected to machines for 48 hours so you can get 2 days of a flat read with no brain activity. Then the doctors can sign the death certificate, making it official. This allowed family and friends to gather. I was at St. Louis University giving a talk. I flew home immediately. I've seen a lot of horrible things in my life, but nothing to compare to the sight of this young man with his head swollen many times its size. It was horrifying. You could barely train your eyes on him. So at the end of the 48-hour period, I gave him a blessing. As a priest, I anointed his forehead with oil. We disconnected. And a week later, I buried him. But in the first 24 hours, as he was lying there beaten, I was alone in my office. It was 8:30 at night, and the phone rings. And it's youngster, Puppet's co-worker from the silkscreen factory. And he says, hey, that's messed up about what happened to Puppet. And I said, yes, it is. And then with a certain kind of eagerness even, he says, is there anything I can do? Can I give him my blood? And we both fall silent under the weight of it, until finally he breaks the silence, choking back his tears, and he says with great deliberation, he was not my enemy, he was my friend. We worked together. Now, can I say that always happens at Homeboy Industries? Yes, of course. Any exceptions? Not a single one. And it shouldn't surprise us that God's own dream come true for us, that we be one, just happens to be our own deepest longing for ourselves. For it turns out it's mutual. And so housing opens the doors to kinship. And we stand against forgetting that we belong to each other. For the vision still has its time, presses on to fulfillment, and it will not disappoint. And if it delays, we wait for it. Thank you very much.